in just a moment here. Oh, here we go. All right, you're good to go.
Perfect. So welcome everyone. My name is Haydn Brooks and I'm giving a talk on startups when security, speed and revenue are all a priority. So I was asked to do this talk by Tony over at EY, and he didn't give me a huge amount of information on what the talk should contain or anything along those lines. So I've thrown something together and yeah, going to see how it goes. And what I've basically done is I'm going to do an introduction of myself, then cover kind of the differences between enterprise and startups real quickly. Then I'm going to cover how that impacts risk, and then cover off some tips for securing a startup just at a really super high level, and then some lessons that you can kind of take from running a startup that you can then apply to enterprises as well. And then I don't know if we can through a Zoom webinar, but always happy to take questions as we go. So I think I've got the chat up in front of me. So any questions as we go, just dump them in the chat and I should be able to see them. So to kick things off, my name's Haydn Brooks. I'm the CEO of a company called Risk Ledger. So I spent 5 years as a cyber risk consultant working mainly with blue chip clients at KPMG and Deloitte, and then at a startup called Setgate. I specialize within supply chain security, and since April 2018, I've been the CEO of Risk Ledger, and we're building a secure social network that mitigates supply chain risk. We're a technology startup, venture-backed. We've raised 1.4 million over the last 2 years. We're starting to work with some really great enterprises. And so I have experience of both kind of working with big companies and seeing how security functions in big companies operate, and then also how small companies operate and how security is typically overlaid within a small company. So I think that's the reason why Tony asked me to do this talk, was basically just to highlight some of the differences and some of the learnings I've had since starting a startup. So jumping straight into it, there's going to be plenty of pictures taken from Silicon Valley and a few memes in here as well. But I thought I'd quickly cover off kind of what an enterprise is like when it comes to their aims, their governance, and their kind of objectives as a company. So typically with an enterprise, you have thousands of employees. They have a lot of clients. They're typically profitable. They're very financially strong with little risk of financial failure, which is the complete opposite of startup. They're typically IPO'd, so they're kind of basically on the public market, which means they don't have any investor pressure. So there's very rarely any kind of single private investor putting any pressure to move the company in any direction. And there's very typically no runway pressure either. So they're not going to run out of money within 6 or 12 months. And so there's no real kind of speed initiative pushing that company forward. They are, however, characterized by large attack surfaces. They have huge networks, a lot of people, a lot of endpoints. The tech tends to be very complex and spread out across a lot of different systems. But conversely, they do have the money to invest in protecting that. And so when it came to priorities, basically with priorities, we typically look at revenue, speed, and security as the 3 kind of main ones, and I tend to put them in an order. And so I came out with an initial order for a standard enterprise, being that their first priority is revenue. As with any business, the board is always going to be focused on revenue because they're there to make money for their investors. The second is on security. So they need to make sure that the company is kept secure. And for a large enterprise, the third is on speed. And the reason for that is that they've already got quite a large market share typically at this stage. And so they don't need to really operate as fast as a startup does in order to be able to capture any more of the market. But there's an interesting observation here, which is that revenue and security are basically linked. In that if an enterprise suffers a failure in security, then typically the revenue of that enterprise will take a hit. And that's quite an interesting point because it means the best conversations that a security team can have with a board are around finances and revenue and how security will impact revenue. And that's probably the quickest way to get the board's attention in an enterprise. And any kind of security project or program should be framed in that way. Now, conversely, if we switch over to startups, startups typically have 10 employees or less with little revenue, if any. They have a few number of clients, again, if any. Most startups may not have clients till post-Series A if they have to do a lot of research and development. They typically have a very small footprint and attack surface as well, so they're quite small targets to hit. And they benefit from quite a defined technology environment, especially within newer technology startups. And the reason for that is because essentially you have your tech environment, which is where all the technology and the actual product you're selling is built. And then you have everything else. And if you imagine within a startup, kind of the most important information is your client data, that will always sit within that production environment. It never really leaves there. So it's quite easy, well-defined, and really kind of nice to document. And you know exactly what you need to protect at all times. And the other thing about startups that they typically have over enterprises, and VCs refer to the founding team of a startup as operators. they tend to be a little bit more kind of focused than employees, in that operators tend to be problem solvers. And so you can rely on them a lot more to think about security and everything they're doing. And they tend to be a lot more reliable when it comes to risk-based decisions as well. But startups do suffer from venture capital pressures and runway pressure and probable death. There is a stat going around where I think it's anywhere between 5 and 15% of all startups fail within the first year. So if you make it through the first year, you're already in kind of the well into the upper quartile of all startups. But that venture capital and runway pressure is essentially built around the fact that as a startup, you're constantly trying to find something that's called product market fit. And it's a bit of a woolly term. But if you look at this graph here, a lot of VCs produce these graphs, and they're kind of a humorous take on actually what it's like to run a startup. But product market fit is the point at which you've built a product that people want to buy, and you can basically repeatedly sell it over and over and over. And at that point, you basically just need to what's called scale your team. So you need a bigger sales team to make more sales. And you can predict that if I'm making 100 sales a month with 10 salespeople, then with 20 salespeople, I make 200 sales a month. And startups are constantly trying to chase for that point. So when I'm talking about startups in this context, it tends to be everything between kind of the founding point and finding that product market fit. For interest, the startup I run, Risk Ledger, is probably just at this stage here. So we're out of the experimenting and the pivoting, but we're not quite at the product market fit stage. So we're just before. So everything I'm saying here, we've kind of just been through, and it's no longer really applicable to us. But it's also very goal and milestone driven. So the whole time that you're running a startup, essentially you are having to meet goals and targets to achieve your next round of funding. And that puts a lot of pressure on typically the team and what they're doing. So at any one point, a lot of startups will have at max 6 months worth of runway. And that means if they don't make any money in the next 6 months, then in 6 months they will run out and they have a cash out date then and effectively die. So there's a lot of kind of things to think about when you're running a startup. And if you throw security into that, then it becomes quite a lot to handle very quickly. So this was a meme that was being thrown around a couple of the venture capital groups a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was quite funny. So when you're running a startup, typically startups are fighting the biggest fires, and that's because everything appears to be on fire. And the reason for that is that it's quite hard to know that there's a problem there until a problem kind of appears, and then you start to feel the problem. And it's at that point that you think, oh, there's a problem there, we need to solve it. And because of this, startups tend to be quite reactionary. There's obviously things that you can plan for and things that you can prepare for, but a lot of the problems that kind of spout up every day do tend to be on the spot and very reactionary. And as a startup kind of founding team, you're constantly striving to find that product market fit, because if you don't, you won't raise that kind of Series A round, which is the key round between non-product market fit and product market fit. And if you don't raise that round, then you are 100% going to die. And because of that, kind of security tends to drop off the mind of a lot of founders in terms of the priorities they have. If they're constantly kind of thinking about how they're going to pay their staff, how they're going to make enough money to get to the next month to raise that next investment round, then losing some data never really kind of creeps into the mind. So given that, the kind of that you would think that security is a really low priority for a lot of startups. Now add to that the fact that security is typically a cost. So, and it's not a financial cost. So security tends to be what's called a speed cost. So if we take a couple of security controls, for example, so we'll take field level encryption. If we were to implement field level encryption into our databases, then in essence, that would slow down the entire production infrastructure that we run. And it would probably quadruple the amount of cost in terms of the amount of compute power we'd need to buy off of AWS. And so because of that, when you're running a startup, a lot of security tends to be a very pragmatic decision. And we get asked a lot by clients if whether we do have field level database encryption. And the question I'd always ask back is that what are you actually protecting with that field level database encryption? The only way really to get into our database is either by going through our app and authenticating against a user account. And if you've broken into a user account, then in essence, you have permission to access that database, or by breaking into our AWS infrastructure and then literally lifting the database straight out of our environment. And if you're able to break into our AWS infrastructure, then there's a lot more damaging things you can do that will cause a lot more data loss than us not having field level database encryption. So within startups, you tend to think of security as being quite a large cost, and you end up having to focus on security controls that provide a better return on investment. So given everything I've just said, you would think that the priorities that I've just laid out in front of you tend to be the priorities of a startup, in that one is speed, and that speed is essentially reaching that product market fit before you run out of money. The second being revenue, and that's chasing clients and trying to win them to get more money in. And then the third would be security, right at the bottom of the pile. However, we pointed out earlier that revenue is basically linked to security. So if your security is terrible and you end up basically having breach after breach after breach, you won't make any money because nobody will want to buy you. And the product market fit is typically evidenced through revenue. So that first priority of speed doesn't really exist without you having some sort of revenue. And it's usually evidenced by that second priority in terms of the amount of money you're making. So a lot of VCs, for example, will say that you need to be making more than £600,000 a year before you're ready for a Series A. Now, because of that, within a startup, there's kind of another way that we think about priorities, and security people tend to love triangles. And so within a startup, the speed, revenue, security kind of dynamic is very much a triangle. So we find that speed and revenue basically drives the need, and then security drives the how. So when we're all basically together as a team or as a board and we're making a decision, what we tend to find is that we think, okay, what do we need to achieve and how quickly do we need to achieve it? And that sets the goal. And then where security comes in is how do we achieve that? And typically we would then layer on security onto the top of that to then enable us to achieve that goal within the speed and revenue kind of limitations that we have. I thought that was quite an interesting way to think about security, because before, when I worked in large organizations, that wasn't really the way that I saw security being inputted into, for example, projects. It wasn't we need to achieve this, what can you do? It very much was, oh, we'll bring security in. And security people tend to detract away from that ultimate goal of what the business needs. So when we think about the board in a startup, the board in startups pretty much thinks about resources and the mission. So it's very much how much resource do I need? Where do I need to deploy it? So whether that's into salespeople, whether that's into product development, in order to achieve that mission. And typically a founder will have like a budget spreadsheet where they do this exercise monthly, where essentially you'll have a pot of money, and each month you're basically just distributing the pot of money to map to that month's or that quarter's goals. And it's all about redistributing that focus and that capital to be able to achieve goals to then hit that next pot of money from the venture capital firms. And so when when I've worked with other startups where they haven't necessarily had a founder who has any experience of security, so it's a bit different for us because I came from a security background, it usually helps not to talk to them about security, but to talk to them about the mission and talk to them about how if they don't do things, that mission is in jeopardy. And when you start switching that conversation away from talking about security and talking towards mission and how there's a risk towards them achieving that mission, you'll start to see that they kind of buy into it a lot more. And that final sentence there, so in order to achieve that, I need this, is typically how I've seen the best conversations between security people and startups phrased. So typically it would be the startup founders saying, okay, we need to do this by this day. And then the CISO, typically a virtual CISO or a CISO, a contract CISO, will turn around and say, okay, well, in order to achieve that, you need to do this. And if you don't have the money or you don't have the focus or you don't have the development resource to be able to do that, then we can do this instead to mitigate as much of that risk as possible. So startups are all about solving problems, and it really helps if security kind of approach it in a pragmatic way around actually helping achieve that mission, rather than just putting in place barriers, which, especially within larger enterprises, it can be often seen that the security team slow things down rather than actually enable things to happen. So given all of that, and given that I've just rattled through the priorities very quickly, I am conscious of time because Phil Huggins is speaking at 8 p.m. and I don't want to stand in between him and the audience. I thought I'd cover off kind of where risk lies in that journey of a startup to an enterprise. And so on the left, I basically noted down some things that affect the risk of a startup, and on the right, noted down some things that affect the risk of an enterprise. So within a startup, you have quite a small team. It's typically founding team members. As I spoke about earlier, they tend to be a little bit more switched on and bought into the mission. So they really do care about what the startup's trying to do. And because of that, they see security as a responsibility, and they really do take it to heart. They tend to have huge awareness. So it tends to be a lot harder to fish a startup than it does an enterprise. And they tend to have a lot more of a smaller digital footprint with very well-defined environments. And in essence, all of that wraps up to actually making security fairly simple. You can focus on a small set of key controls and keep the risk of a startup actually suffering a security incident as relatively low. Similarly, in an enterprise, they tend to have an experienced security team there. They have the money to be able to invest in the security operations center and invest in security consultants to come in and help them protect their assets. Their staff tend to have a little bit lower awareness because you're talking about thousands of employees, and they tend to have a huge digital footprint with really complicated environments. But because of that large investment, you tend to find that enterprises have a low to medium risk as well. So the real risk tends to lie in between the two companies. So this is in where we call Staleups, and that's where a startup of, let's say, 10 people have just hit product market fit. They've just raised £10 million, and they now have to get from 10 people to 300 people within a year. So I worked with a person who came from Cylon, David Chan, who was saying that when he was running a company out in Silicon Valley, it got to about 30 people. And at 30 people, he then had hit product market fit and had to scale the whole company. And I can't remember the exact kind of number, but he was saying he doubled his headcount pretty much every quarter. And you can imagine growing that fast, growing that quickly without the infrastructure to support it, is where you do find a lot of these incidents start to creep up when it comes to startups and scale-ups. Another reason for that is that you do end up rapidly scaling the development team as well. And so you end up having to lower the bar in terms of your hiring sometimes. And that basically leads to kind of poor testing, poor deployments into the tech. And you end up with a lot of kind of problems being kind of driven to the surface during that stage. So I thought I'd cover off quickly some tips when it comes to helping startups with security. So when you're dealing with security in a startup, speed is very much the priority. So founders always kind of talk about speed. We want to basically reach that product market fit as quickly as possible. And anything that gets between us and reaching that product market fit, very much we see as a blocker and something that we want to remove. And so security has to be really low friction. Now, startups have some quite creative ways of actually making security low friction. And I would say that even in the terms of process and policy-based security controls, they tend to be quite innovative in the way they think about them. So you can do some quite kind of complicated security controls, or controls that would be complicated in enterprises, quite easily in a 10-man startup. So for example, you can run approvals through Slack. Instead of you waiting 3 days for a reply in an email, a Slack message and then a reply is pretty instant. We have weekly stand-ups, and you can raise security awareness in the stand-up every single week. And because of that, your employees tend to be very kind of hot on spotting phishing emails and keeping your laptops up to date. Similarly, when it comes to end-user patch management, we all know that's kind of a huge problem for large enterprises. Within startups, it's fairly simple to just get everybody to dump a screenshot of the last time they updated their system into Slack once a week, and then you know that everyone's laptops are kept up to date. So you end up finding some quite easy and quick hack arounds these controls that typically would require a tool in a large enterprise that do end up meaning you mitigate a lot more risk than you would otherwise. So the second tip is compliance is basically only part of the solution. So we spoke earlier about how revenue and security are linked. And the reason for that is that you're not going to make any money if you are having breaches. And secondly, you're not going to make any sales if you don't have any security that you can show. And so a lot of startups, rightly or wrongly, because of this, they think, okay, we need to win some enterprises. We need a certificate to show that we take security seriously. And a lot of startups end up falling down the trap of being an 8-man band trying to get an ISO 27001 certificate. And the problem with that is that these frameworks are built for enterprises. They tend to be quite heavy, tend to be very expensive to get. They require constant auditing, so satellite audits. And you end up with the startup spending more time worrying and more focus being spent on getting a certificate than actually securing the startup and showing the client how secure they are. And that goes for the more heavier frameworks, so ISO and NIST CSF being one of them, although nobody in the UK already certifies against that. I would point out there's some lighter weight certifications, so Cyber Essentials being a good one, that are often quite good for startups to get, because it kind of instills very early on in the journey the core key controls that you need to make sure your company has as you grow. And they're quite simple and easy certifications to comply with. So with Cyber Essentials, I'd recommend a company called CyberSmart. They can do same-day certification typically if the startup doesn't have any issues that need fixing. So thirdly, security is typically driven by the clients in a startup. So within a large enterprise, especially if the enterprise is B2C, you find that security is driven by an internal audit team or by external auditors. But in startups, you are very much driven by what wins you a client in order to be able to evidence that product market fit. So we tend not to have the money to be able to spend on reviews. And so it really actually helps us, for our clients, have a strong assurance program in place, and for them to be able to eloquently basically tell us what they need us to have in order for them to be happy to procure us. And that's what my startup company does, and it ends up being a bit of a conversation. So a lot of times clients will tell you to have something, and you'll turn around and think, actually, we don't need that because, and it ends up kind of helping do your risk assessment anyway, that conversation. And that's probably the most valuable and effective way to engage startups when it comes to security, because you're able to relate that security problem back to the other two problems of speed and revenue and evidencing that product market fit. So the fourth thing is know what you're protecting. So tech startups basically have the incredible advantage of, as I said, having all of their data in one place fairly easily. They don't have much kind of data corruption or bits of data being spread all over the place. The environments are really well defined. And so when you're in a startup, use that to your advantage. If you know that all of the client data, which really is the crown jewels, sits within one environment, make sure that all of your key controls are focused around keeping that environment secure. Within our company, we kind of tend to think of client data as sacred, and that all sits within our AWS production environment. Anything outside of that is non-client related. It tends to be emails, tends to be financial information about the company, and that sort of stuff. Although it's not something you want public, it's not necessarily disastrous if it does escape. So that really helps kind of shift your focus onto what's important and be able to keep the real kind of important stuff secure. Similarly, alongside that, focus on key controls. So a lot of startups very early on try and adopt control sets of kind of 200 controls spread across the place. And when in reality, if a startup has a kind of a stringent set of policies, conducts regular penetration tests, and has a strong incident response plan in place, the risk of that startup actually suffering a serious security breach is going to be quite low already. And the big key control there would be a penetration test. So as long as the startup's continuously testing the resilience of their systems, then you tend to find that actually the risk of those systems being breached really does drop. And finally, be honest. So security is a conversation, not a pass-fail test. And it very much is like, don't lie to clients. Make sure you tell them the truth, because at worst, they're going to tell you to improve something, and they're going to tell you why, and you're going to learn from that. And at best, well, at worst, especially get sued. At best, you learn something. But that picture on the right there of that meme is a kind of probably the best example of honesty I've ever seen. So I actually looked this up, and there was a bit of tech, and basically the tech wasn't holding any sensitive data on behalf of the user. And so they literally wrote, pick a password, don't reuse your bank password. We didn't spend a lot on security for this app. And that's a really good message to give to your users, because if I'm just using that app to do a nifty little thing, not really giving it any personal data or any kind of data that I deem as critical, then I now know not to reuse my password, and I'm definitely going to choose a password that I don't mind if it ends up on the internet in plain text. So taking some of those things, I thought I would cover off some of the lessons I would now apply if I were to go back to Big Four and start working with large enterprises. And the first lesson is that security is rarely the #1 priority for any board. It tends to be a means to an end. So security tends to be the how you get somewhere. And that's probably something I've learned in startups, but thinking back, most enterprises do kind of have this as well. It's a characteristic, I think, of all organizations. And a lot of senior security people tend not to understand it. So on that picture there, you can just see a spread of a load of issues that a board worries about. And if you add security in there as well, suddenly you can see risk management on the far right. So that's one of many things that your board are thinking about. So second, security often has to do what they can with what they have. And this is another thing I've learned in startups. So a lot of times in enterprises, you hear security people moan about budgets or about resource. And this is trying to link to that point #1. And if you're not the priority for the board, then they're not going to be willing to throw money at you to solve problems. And so because of that, I think a lot of the lessons I've learned in startups around hacking together security controls to mitigate risk are something that I would then apply to enterprises, in terms of if you can't get the budget to do something, at least having something that's 80% of the way there definitely does reduce the risk and definitely does help. And your board will appreciate it as well, because typically they're not giving you the money because they want to hold on to it. It's typically because they don't actually have the resource to be able to deploy to the security team. The third lesson I learned was basically start with the basics and keep it super simple. The VCs refer to this as the 80-20 rule. And it's essentially that you take 20% of the amount of time on a task to get to 80% of the output. And then it's the last 80% of the time that you spent perfecting it to get it up to 100%. So you start with the basics, start with the key controls, make sure you do them well, and don't fall down rabbit holes of chasing down these kind of little controls that don't really make a huge impact on the risk. And fourthly, speak the board's language. So boards talk mission and they talk resource. So Phil Huggins actually speaks a lot about this in terms of talking about risk in the financial sense. And that's really what does resonate with the board. So if somebody comes to, for example, even our startup and says they need to do this security thing, it's not really going to resonate with the founders unless we kind of hear we need to do this because it's going to impact our finances, it's going to impact our ability to win this client, it's going to impact our ability to achieve this mission. And you really do have to relate it back to one of those priorities that the board does have. And that's one of the key skills that I see a lot of security people come from a very technical background. And I think one of the key skills that's often overlooked on, especially kind of in the GRC space and with CISOs, is the people side of things and being able to talk to a business, being able to negotiate and persuade. And I actually recently read this book, Never Split the Difference. That's a really good book around talking about how to negotiate with other people and seeing things from their point of view. And I think that would really help engage boards within companies. And finally, do we have a
short? Sorry, do we have a quick wrap up?
Yeah, that's
okay,
the last slide anyway. So yeah, don't be perfect because you can't be. Focus on the key controls. All done.
Perfect. And I'm gonna stop the recording. Someone did have a question. What would you do differently if you could go back a year?
Say that again. Sorry, you broke up a little bit.
What would you do differently if you could go back a year? Just that.
What would I do differently if I could go back a year? That's going to take me longer to think about it than it is to answer it.
Right. Well,
I think I would have focused. So coming from a security background, I started focusing on security from day one, which is a really good thing to do. But it meant that, for example, the dev team initially was spending a lot of time building in security features when we had no clients. And I think I would have reversed that. So I think I probably actually would have spent more time and resource building out the platform and then thinking about security and thinking about how we would fit that in, but then shift the focus onto security maybe 3 or 4 months later. But I think that's just by nature of most entrepreneurs think they're going to make loads of sales within the first month, and it typically takes a lot longer than that to win enterprises.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool.
It's been a great talk. See you at the next presentation.